It was a Tuesday. Just another Tuesday in the long, slow march of days at the Blackwood Correctional Facility. But this Tuesday would be different. It would be seared into the memory of every person who witnessed it. A day when a simple act of defiance spiraled into something else entirely. A moment when a line was crossed, and in the chaos that followed, a secret was laid bare for all to see. The air in Cell Block C was always thick with something: despair, anger, the faint smell of bleach and regret. But on this day, it was charged with a new kind of electricity, a current that would soon arc between two people, a prisoner and a guard, and change their lives forever. They say in prison, trouble doesn't knock. It kicks the door down. And the trouble that day started small, as it often does. A disagreement over a meal tray, a harsh word, a shove. It was the kind of friction that happened a dozen times a day within those walls, usually ending with a quick show of force and a trip to solitary. But not this time. This time, the spark caught. It ignited a fire that had been smoldering for months, a tension between an inmate named Marcus Reck Relander and a corrections officer named Amelia Vance. It was a confrontation that had been brewing in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to explode into the light. Imagine the scene: a long gray corridor, the echoing clang of metal on concrete, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Men in drab jumpsuits watch from behind steel bars, their faces a mixture of boredom and anticipation. They can smell it, the way animals can smell a storm coming. A fight, a real one. Officer Vance stood her ground, her hand hovering near her belt. Marcus stood opposite her, his fists clenched, his jaw set like stone. The argument had escalated, the words becoming sharper, more personal. Each one a jab, a test of will, pushing them closer to an edge neither of them truly wanted to go over. And then it happened. The push that became a grab. The grab that became a struggle. A desperate, clumsy dance of force and resistance in the middle of that cold, unforgiving hallway. It was a moment suspended in time, a tableau of raw, human conflict. For everyone watching, it was just another show, another chapter in the brutal story of prison life. But for Marcus and Amelia, it was the final, irreversible step. The moment when everything they thought they knew about each other and about themselves was about to be torn apart. Quite literally. Blackwood Correctional was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a world unto itself, a brutal kingdom of concrete and steel rising from the flat, forgotten plains. The rules here were simple: survive. The official rules were written in a handbook, but the real ones were written in scars and whispered in the yard. Every day was the same grinding routine, a metronome of lockdown, count, chow, and back again. The monotony was a kind of torture in itself, designed to break a man's spirit long before his sentence was up. It bred a specific kind of tension, a low, constant hum of aggression that could erupt over the smallest slight. A stolen look, a bumped shoulder, a cold meal. Inside this fortress, the air was heavy with the weight of lost time. Years, decades, lifetimes ticked away under the indifferent gaze of the guard towers. The sounds were a symphony of despair, the distant wail of a siren, the echoing slam of a cell door, the constant murmur of 1,000 hushed and angry conversations. You learned to navigate this world quickly. You learned who to trust, which was almost no one. You learned who to fear, which was almost everyone. And you learned to build a wall around yourself, a fortress of indifference to protect whatever small piece of your soul you had left. It was a place that chewed up hope and spit out hardened shells of men. The relationship between the inmates and the corrections officers, the COs, was a complicated dance of authority and resentment. The officers were there to enforce the rules, to maintain order in a place that was designed for chaos. They were outnumbered and, in many ways, just as trapped as the men they guarded. They walked the tiers with a practiced air of confidence, but you could see the stress etched around their eyes. They were the keepers of the cage, and the inmates were the lions, always watching, always waiting for a sign of weakness. It was a fragile truce, a cold war fought with glares and insults that could turn hot in a heartbeat. Danger was a constant companion. It was in the mess hall, in the showers, in the crowded yard where alliances were forged and broken with brutal finality. Every interaction was a calculation of risk. Every day you woke up was a small victory. You learned to read the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the sudden silences that meant trouble was on its way. It was a place where survival depended on your ability to anticipate the next move, to see the threat before it materialized. And on this particular Tuesday, the air in cell block C was crackling with a danger that no one could have anticipated. Marcus Relander, or Rec as he was known inside, was a product of the system. He'd been in and out of institutions since he was a teenager, a life of bad choices and worse luck that had finally landed him a 10-year stretch at Blackwood for armed robbery. He wasn't a monster, not really. But the world had taught him that the only way to not be a victim was to be a threat. He was big, covered in faded tattoos that told the story of his life, and he carried himself with a quiet intensity that most other inmates knew better than to test. He kept to himself, did his time, and dreamed of a life he wasn't sure he was even capable of living anymore. On the other side of the bars was Officer Amelia Vance. She was in her late 20s, younger than many of the COs, but she had a reputation for being firm, fair, and unflappable. She wasn't naive. She knew the dangers of the job, the constant psychological warfare. But she believed in the possibility of rehabilitation, a belief that most of her colleagues had long since abandoned. She treated the inmates like human beings, a simple act that earned her a strange mix of respect and suspicion. To some, she was a breath of fresh air. To others, like Marcus, her perceived kindness was a weakness, a chink in the armor of authority that he felt compelled to test. Their paths had crossed many times in the year since Vance had been assigned to Cell Block C. Their interactions were always professional, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a silent challenge. Marcus saw her as part of the system that had caged him, a system he instinctively fought against. He would push the boundaries with her, a sarcastic comment here, a refusal to follow a minor order there. He was testing her, trying to see if she would break, if she would show the same contempt that he saw in the eyes of the other guards. He wanted to prove that her fairness was a facade, a mask she wore to get through the day. Amelia, for her part, saw something in Marcus that others missed. Beneath the hardened exterior, she sensed a flicker of the man he could have been. She refused to be baited by his provocations, meeting his aggression with a calm resolve that seemed to infuriate him even more. She would write him up for infractions, but she would also ask if he'd heard from his family. This duality confused Marcus. He didn't know how to categorize her. She wasn't an enemy, but she wasn't a friend. She was an anomaly in his black and white world, and that made her a target for the frustration that was always boiling just beneath his surface. The fuse was lit during the morning count, a simple, routine procedure. But Marcus was in a dark place. A letter from home had been delayed. Another small cut in a death by 1,000 cuts. He was surly, uncooperative. Officer Vance was the one walking the tier. She told him to stand for the count. He refused. It was a small act of defiance, but in a place where order is everything, it was a challenge that could not be ignored. The other inmates in their cells fell silent, watching the drama unfold. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the confrontation between the immovable object and the unstoppable force. Vance followed procedure. She repeated the order, her voice steady, betraying none of the tension she felt. "Relander, on your feet. Now." Marcus just stared at her, a smirk playing on his lips. It was a power play, pure and simple. He was asserting his control over the one thing he had left, his own body. In that moment, he wasn't just defying her, he was defying the entire system. He was screaming into the void, and she was the one who had to hear it. The air grew thick and heavy. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Every eye in the cell block was on them. Backup was called. 2 more officers arrived, their presence escalating the situation instantly. The quiet tension was now a palpable threat. They unlocked Marcus's cell door, the sound of the bolt sliding back like the cocking of a gun. The plan was to escort him to solitary confinement, the whole to cool off. But Marcus wasn't going to make it easy. As soon as the door opened, he lunged, not at the 2 larger male officers, but directly at Vance. It wasn't a calculated attack. It was pure, blind rage. A geyser of frustration that had finally blown. He wasn't trying to hurt her, not really. He was just trying to push back, to make a mark. The struggle was a blur of motion, a chaotic tangle of limbs in the narrow doorway of the cell. The other officers grabbed at Marcus, trying to pull him back, but he was a man possessed, fueled by years of pent-up anger. He reached for Vance, his hands finding purchase on the front of her uniform shirt. He wasn't thinking, he was just reacting. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at the nearest symbol of his confinement. And in that moment, with a guttural roar of frustration, he pulled. He pulled with all his strength, with all his anger, with all his despair. The fabric was the only thing between them, and it was about to give way. Time seemed to slow down. The sound in the cell block, the shouts of the officers, the jeers of the inmates, faded into a dull, distant roar. For Marcus, there was only the feel of the rough, starched fabric in his hands. He heard the sound before he felt it. A sharp, tearing sound. Rip! It was louder than a gunshot in the sudden, strange silence of his mind. The blue material of Officer Vance's uniform shirt parted in his hands, splitting down the middle from the collar. It was an act of violation, a final, irrevocable line crossed. He had done it. He had broken her composure, her authority. He had won. But then he saw it, and the victory turned to ash in his mouth. As the shirt ripped open, it exposed the white t-shirt she wore underneath. And on that t-shirt, just below her collarbone, was a tattoo. It wasn't a large tattoo. It was small, discreet, a simple, elegant design. But it was a design he knew better than he knew his own face. It was a small, stylized bird, a sparrow, with a single broken wing. A design he had drawn himself, a lifetime ago, in a cheap notebook with a stolen pen. A design that meant everything to him, a symbol of hope and freedom that he had clung to through the darkest years of his life. The world stopped spinning. Marcus's hands fell away from her shirt as if he had been burned. His mind struggled to connect the impossible. Officer Vance, Amelia Vance, the crisp, no-nonsense guard, and this tattoo, his tattoo. The one he had designed for his little sister Sarah on her 18th birthday, just before he was sent away for the last time. The sister he hadn't seen or heard from in nearly a decade. The sister who had promised to write, but never did. The sister he had assumed had moved on, forgotten him, started a new life far away from the wreckage of his own. He looked up from the tattoo, from the impossible ink on her skin, and met her eyes. And for the first time, he didn't see a corrections officer. He didn't see authority or judgment or pity. He saw the same shock, the same dawning, horrified recognition that he felt churning in his own gut. He saw her face, really saw it for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth. The features were older, harder, etched with a life he knew nothing about, but they were undeniably hers. It was Sarah, his little sister Sarah, standing in front of him, wearing a uniform and a badge, in the middle of the hell that was his life. The noise of the cell block rushed back in, but it was different now. The jeers and catcalls from the other inmates died in their throats. They had seen the rip, and they had waited for the explosion of violence that was sure to follow. But it never came. Instead, they saw something far more shocking. They saw Marcus Relander, wreck, the man who feared nothing and no one, stumble backward as if he'd been struck by lightning. His face, usually a mask of hardened indifference, was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide with a kind of terror they had never seen before. Officer Vance, Sarah, stood frozen in place. Her hands instinctively came up to cover the torn shirt, to hide the secret that was now exposed for all to see. Her professional mask had shattered, and beneath it was a woman on the verge of collapse. Tears welled in her eyes, a mixture of fear, shame, and a decade of buried grief. The other two officers were just as stunned. They had been ready for a brawl, their hands on their batons. Now they just stood there, their training offering no protocol for this. They looked from Marcus to Vance and back again, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The silence that fell over Cell Block C was profound. It was a heavy, weighted silence, a vacuum where all the usual anger and noise had been. You could have heard a pin drop on the cold concrete floor. The inmates in their cells, men who lived for drama and chaos, were utterly still. They had just witnessed something intensely private, something sacred, desecrated in the most public way imaginable. They didn't understand what they were seeing, not exactly, but they knew it was something deeper and more painful than a simple fight between a guard and a prisoner. They saw the shared, raw pain on the faces of Marcus and his sister, and for a moment, they were not prisoners. They were just men, watching a family tragedy unfold. Marcus took a step forward, his hand reaching out, not in aggression, but in a gesture of disbelief. "Sarah?" he whispered. The name was a ghost on his lips, a word he hadn't spoken aloud in years. It hung in the air, fragile and broken. Amelia. Sarah flinched at the sound of her name, at the sound of his voice saying it. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, a small, desperate gesture of denial. But it was too late. The secret was out. The brother and sister, separated by time, by choices, by the very walls of the prison itself, had found each other in the worst possible way. The immediate aftermath was a blur of quiet, procedural chaos. Amelia was quickly escorted away by a senior officer, her face pale, her torn shirt shielded from view. Marcus offered no resistance as he was led to a solitary holding cell, his usual defiance replaced by a stunned, hollow obedience. The story spread through Blackwood like a virus, whispered through vents and passed in notes. The tough-as-nails Officer Vance and the hardened inmate Rec Relander were brother and sister. The revelation sent a shockwave through the rigid social structure of the prison, a place where such a connection was not just unlikely, it was unthinkable. It changed everything. For Amelia, the fallout was swift. She was placed on immediate leave, pending an investigation. Her career, the life she had so carefully built to distance herself from her family's past, was in ruins. She had hidden her connection to Marcus, ashamed of his choices and terrified that it would destroy the new identity she had forged. Now, her worst fear had come true in the most public and humiliating way. She was forced to confront the brother she had tried to forget and the past she had tried to bury. The incident forced a painful reunion, a series of stilted, tearful conversations through reinforced glass, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. For Marcus, the change was even more profound. The rage that had fueled him for so long seemed to evaporate, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching shame. He had attacked his own sister. He had put her in danger, destroyed her career, and humiliated her in front of the very people she was meant to control. In the stark silence of his solitary cell, he was forced to look at the man he had become. The revelation didn't excuse his crimes, but it reframed his existence. His fight was no longer against an abstract system. It was against the pain he had caused the one person he should have protected. It was a turning point, a rock bottom from which the only way to go was up. That day left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The other inmates saw something that day that they rarely saw, a truth that was more powerful than violence. The incident became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered on the tiers about the day Rec Relander ripped a CO's shirt and found his own sister. It was a stark reminder that beneath the uniforms and the jumpsuits, behind the numbers and the titles, there were just people. People with histories, with families, with secrets. The rip in that shirt tore open more than just fabric. It tore open a hidden reality, and in the silence that followed, it forced everyone to see the broken humanity that connected them all.